So we're going to dive into this analysis of the 2026 Iran campaign. Now, a lot of people saw this as a huge, sudden policy change, right? But this analysis argues it was anything but sudden. In fact, it was the logical conclusion of a strategy that played out over decades.
You've probably heard this question before, right? For 40 long years, it looked like the West was just standing by. So, was it weakness? Was it just indecision? Well, the analysis we're digging into today says that question, that whole frame of thinking, completely misses the point.
Okay, so here's the central idea that everything else hinges on. It's called the calculus of conflict. And it's actually a pretty simple but really powerful concept. The idea is this: you don't just jump into action because there's a threat. No. You act only when you reach that specific moment, that tipping point, where doing nothing is actually riskier than doing something.
So, with that in mind, let's go back and look at those 40 years of what everyone called inaction. This analysis makes the case that it wasn't passive waiting at all. It was actually an incredibly disciplined, active strategy of delay.
And the whole guiding principle behind that delay was really simple. The cure can't be worse than the disease. Any military action had to fix more problems than it cost. And for decades, a big campaign would have been a disaster, way worse than the problem it was trying to solve. Let's get specific, though. How did this calculus actually work in practice? Well, think about 1990. The risk to the entire global economy was just way too high. Fast forward to 2005, Iran's Revolutionary Guard. They were a unified force, and a conflict would have been incredibly long and bloody. Even as recently as 2015, the price of a military strike was still considered way higher than the threat Iran posed at that moment. At every single one of these points, the calculus gave the same answer: wait.
This whole idea isn't even new. The analysis points to an old parable to make its point. It basically says, what smart king rushes into war, right? A wise leader sits down first, they figure out if they can actually win, they assess everything. This isn't some modern sign of weakness. It's timeless, ancient wisdom.
But then we get to 2026, and everything changes. Something fundamental shifted. Suddenly, the scales just completely tipped. The cost of doing nothing, of waiting even one more day, was now astronomical. That whole calculus we've been talking about, it completely flipped on its head.
So what happened? Well, according to this analysis, it wasn't just one thing. It was 4 specific factors that all came together at the exact same time, creating this perfect storm. You had Iran's nuclear breakout, its advanced missiles, a vulnerable regime at home, and finally, allies who were actually ready to go. And the biggest one, the one that really lit the fuse, was this: 90%. In late 2025, inspectors confirmed it. Iran had enriched uranium to 90% purity. That's weapons grade. This wasn't just another step on a ladder. This was the finish line. This was the point of no return. So you see how these 4 pieces fit together, right? The nuclear breakout made it urgent, like now or never urgent. At the same time, Iran's new super-precise missiles meant that any military advantage the West had was literally shrinking by the day. Then you have the situation inside Iran. Huge protests made the regime vulnerable, so a strike wouldn't necessarily rally everyone to their side. And finally, the allies were actually prepared for a real coordinated strike. It was this perfect but very narrow window of opportunity, and it was closing fast. Now, obviously, a decision like this is going to have a ton of critics. And this analysis knows that. It actually anticipates the big counterarguments and addresses them head on.
So the first big one you hear is this: wasn't this whole thing just a pretext? Weren't they just using the conflict in Gaza as an excuse? But the analysis argues that that's getting it backwards. It's mistaking the symptom for the actual disease.
Sure, Iran publicly framed it as being all about Gaza, but their actions? They told a completely different story. Look at what they were targeting: military bases, energy infrastructure. This wasn't just posturing for the cameras. They were running a test, a live experiment to see how far they could push, to test Western resolve. And, well, they seriously miscalculated.
Okay, what about the other big question: timing? People ask, if this was always going to happen, why not do it in 2010 or 2015? Why wait all the way until 2026?
And the answer goes right back to that calculus. The world looked completely different in 2026 than it did in 2010. I mean, think about it. Back then, the nuclear program was years away from breakout. Sanctions, maybe, still had a chance of working. And the regime itself was solid, unified. A strike back then would have just rallied the Iranian people around them. Fast forward to 2026, and every single one of those facts was the exact opposite.
So what was victory even supposed to look like here?
It's really important to get this. This was not about conquest. This wasn't about occupation. The goal was something the analysis calls a strategic reset, a really targeted campaign designed to do two things: neutralize that immediate existential threat and create a situation where long-term stability was actually possible. And if you measure it by those goals, it was a success. The Strait of Hormuz, which is critical for the world's oil supply, stayed open. Iran's nuclear program got pushed back by years. Their military leadership was completely fractured. And maybe the most important part? It didn't crush the reform movements inside Iran. In fact, it actually gave them room to breathe and grow.
Which brings us right back to the beginning, to the main point of this whole analysis. Those 40 years of waiting, that wasn't weakness. It wasn't a failure of nerve. It was discipline. It was strategic patience. It was the incredible restraint to wait for that one precise moment when the calculus finally flipped, when doing nothing became, without a doubt, the most dangerous option on the table. A truly difficult calculation, but in the end, it was the one that defined everything.